Hi guys, thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Clara. Today's video is a perfect video for anyone who just started their sewing journey. So if you just got your first sewing machine or if you swapped to another model, this is a great video for you because I will show you a few simple steps you can practice in order to grow more confident in your sewing skills, and that will definitely help you further before you move on to sewing projects, and it will also create kind of a connection between you and your sewing machine. But before we start, especially if you are new to this, I highly recommend watching my introduction to sewing machine first. There are several videos that will help you to understand how a sewing machine works, how to thread a sewing machine, how to wind bobbins, how to do basic maintenance, how to fix faulty stitches, and it also explains the most common sewing feet. So it's necessary that you understand all these things first before we go on with this course. And if you already watched these, we can jump right into this. Today we're gonna start out very simple. We are going to try out several stitches and what you can do with the different types of stitches. And for that, I prepared here a few pieces of different kinds of fabric. So I have here a cotton fabric that's been woven into this checked pattern. This is also a woven fabric, but it's a different material. It's partially polyester and it's also a little bit stretchy. This is a cotton fabric with a print on it. You can easily recognize that it's a print because when you turn the fabric to the wrong side, it won't look as pretty as from the right side. Next, I have here two pieces of denim. I have here a few pieces of jersey, and then I have here another cotton fabric, but this time without any pattern on it. Next, I have here different types of needles. So I have here the standard needles, then needles for stretchy fabrics and needles for denim fabrics. I have here a few bobbins with colorful thread on them. This is some leftover yarn I want to use up, and this is the perfect type of project for it. And I personally recommend that you would use for this practice any kind of yarn that would be a contrast color so that it's gonna be easily visible on any fabric that you're gonna be using. So I picked this neon yellowish green. I used this yarn only once for something very little, and I know I'm not gonna use this one anymore, so it's actually perfect for today. Plus, that's a color that's gonna be easily visible on each of these pieces. The first thing we're gonna do together today is to practice sewing with straight stitch, which is also the most important stitch in sewing, a stitch that you're gonna be using all the time. So I set up my machine to the standard settings, and that means on my machine is the needle completely on the left side and the length of the stitch is 2.5. I'm using the sewing foot that the machine recommends, which is the zigzag sewing foot. I'm gonna place the fabric a little bit further behind this little window where the needle comes through, and I am going to align the edge, the right edge of the sewing foot with this line of the pink section of the checked fabric. And now I will start sewing. So I have the machine set up so that it's gonna do the sew up first. And that means it goes a few stitches forward and a few stitches back before it starts sewing. And now I'm gonna make sure that while I'll be sewing, the edge of the sewing foot will be always aligned with the outer edge of this pink section. Now we came to the end, and I can ask my machine to do the sew up, which is what I'm gonna do. So the machine is going to go a few stitches back and a few stitches forward, and then it's gonna cut the thread. And here you can see our stitches. So perfectly straight, nicely aligned with the outer edge of the pink section. So, and that's a step you can practice a couple of times, especially at the beginning, so that you get a feel for the sensitivity of the pedal of your sewing machine. And if you can adjust the speed on your sewing machine, you can check out what speed works the best for you. and then you will feel more confident once you practice this a few more times. The next practice is to use these lines that are next to the sewing foot as a guide. So I cut off the edge here so that it would be perfectly straight. And that's important because I'm going to align the edge with one of these lines. So let's say with the line that's marked as 3. So that's 3 centimeters. And I'm gonna move the fabric again so that it goes a little bit behind the window of the sewing foot, and we'll start sewing. Again, standard settings, and the machine will do the sew up first because that's how it's set up. If you don't have a machine that has the sew up function, you can simply sew a few stitches forward and a few stitches back, because most sewing machines have the return button, and then you can continue sewing. So as you can see, I'm aligning the edge with the line here, and that's the place that I'm keeping my eye on. It always helps also to grab the fabric in the back and smoothen it and straighten it so that the edge of the fabric copies the line nicely. And I definitely recommend sewing a little bit slower, especially at the beginning, until it feels more comfortable for you. And now I'm not gonna do the sew up, I'm simply gonna cut the thread. Here we have our second seam, again perfectly straight. It is a little bit inside of the pink section. That's because I didn't use the edge of the pink section as a guide, but this outer edge. Next, I'm going to increase the length of my stitch. So I set it up 1 full point longer. So instead of 2.5, it's going to be 3.5 long. And instead of using the edge of the fabric as a guide, either aligned with one of these lines or with the edge of the sewing foot, I'm going to align the right edge of the sewing foot with this seam that we just made. And the machine is again gonna do the sew up first, and then we can sew while aligning the edge with the seam, the edge of the sewing foot, that is. Now, when you look closer at the stitches, you will notice that these stitches are longer than the original stitches. Once you feel more comfortable, you can move on to a fabric that has no pattern on it. So I'm going to align the edge of this light green fabric with one of these lines. I'm going to move it so that it goes a little bit behind the little window of our zigzag sewing foot. Let's lower the sewing foot. And I set up the machine to the length of the straight stitch 3, and we'll start sewing while aligning the edge with this line. So the sew up. And even though I have my machine set up to the maximum speed, I can still adjust the speed with the pressure that I apply on my sewing foot. That's something you really have to practice, because it's going to help you with projects where you will, let's say, sew around rounded edges, or where you're going to be working with some really sensitive fabric. It's always great to get a feel for it so that you don't rely on the standard speed. Now we're here at the end. I'm not going to do the sew up, I'm just going to cut the thread. And here we go. We made our first stitch, first seam. And now I'm going to show you how you can use the straight stitch in order to gather your fabric. So you have to set up the sewing machine to the maximum length of the straight stitch. So that's the length 5 on my sewing machine. I will still do the sew up at the beginning, because sometimes when I gather the fabric and I don't do the sew up, I accidentally very often pull out the thread on one side, and I want to avoid that, so I will do the sew up. If you don't want to do the sew up, you can simply pull out the yarn a little bit further, both the bottom yarn and both the top yarn, because that's going to help you to grab the yarn and to hold it securely so that you wouldn't pull it out accidentally. But because my sewing machine cuts the thread as well, I usually only have a little chunk at the end when or actually at the beginning when I start sewing, and that's why when I start gathering it would be pulled out. So that's why I'm doing the sew up. So let's start. So I'm gonna use this seam that we just made together as a guide. So I'm gonna align the right side of my sewing foot, but let's move the needle a little bit further to the center. So I'm basically gonna move it exactly to the center. And the stitch length is 5, as I mentioned. It has to be the maximum length. So and we're gonna make a straight seam first. So here we go, that's the sew up. Now I'm at the end, but instead of cutting the thread, I will simply lift the sewing foot. I will grab the fabric somewhere on the seam so that it doesn't get pulled. And I'm gonna pull a bit of the yarn out and I'm gonna cut it myself. And now I will grab one of the yarns and I will pull on it and start gathering the fabric with my hand like so. And while you gather the fabric, you can always adjust how much it's gathered. So you can make it a little bit denser or a little bit looser. And that's a great way how to do that very easily. I mean, there are gathering feet for this type of thing, but you don't necessarily need them because you can gather your fabric easily like this with simply the maximum length of your straight stitch. I tied the ends on the right side here so that it wouldn't come loose, and here it goes. This is what it looks like. And now we will start practicing zigzag. So I'll set my machine to zigzag and let's make simply a line of a zigzag stitch so that you see what it looks like. This time I'm not going to do the sew up, and I will use the right edge of the sewing foot as a guide aligned with this seam. Here you go, here we have our zigzag stitch. So it looks like little V's, and you also want to see little V's on the wrong side, because if it makes different shapes, then you need to adjust either the tension of your sewing machine or maybe even swap the needle, or the machine might have some minor issues with dust. All about that is in my video about how to fix faulty stitches, so I'm not going to go into further details. I could probably decrease the tension of the yarn, but I'm going to leave it like that. It's fine. I think for the demonstrational purposes it looks okay. Now I'm going to increase the width of the zigzag and I'm going to leave the length as it is. I'm going to go for the maximum width, because that way it's gonna be more understandable to see the difference. So I'm simply sewing same length, only much higher width. I'm aligning the edge of the sewing foot with the edge of the zigzag. Here we go, so you can see that the stitch is now wider than this stitch, but you can also see that it's equally dense because the length of the stitch is the same, which is what I'm gonna increase now to show you the difference. So I'm gonna make it long 3 points, and I'm again going to use, let's say, one of the pink sections as a guide. So and now you can see that this zigzag stitch looks a little bit different because the V's are also less dense. So that's increased width and increased length when you compare it with the original zigzag stitch. So I hope that this made it understandable. When you use zigzag for edging, you have to keep in mind that the stitches have to come exactly to the edge. So if I would use this side of the sewing foot as a guide, I would be too far from the edge. So this time I'm gonna use this edge of the little window, the very right side of the little window, as my guide. So I'm gonna align it with the edge of the fabric. And let's leave the settings as they are, so a little bit wider and longer, and I'll start sewing. And also what I find helps is, instead of feeding, like letting the fabric move into the sewing machine straight like so, I find that it's almost better when I have it a little bit at an angle, because the machine has a tendency to kind of slide to the side. And when I hold it slightly angled, I just have better results. So that's what works for me. Important thing is that the edge will always be aligned exactly with the edge of the inside window. And I also take my time. I don't sew too fast with this, because again, then I get so much better result. Let's chop the thread off. And I think at this point I ran out of the thread on the bobbin, but we still edged quite a lot so that you can see what it looks like. And of course it's better to make it a bit denser, so a little bit lower stitch length so that the edge wouldn't fray out. Now I'm going to show you how you can use zigzag stitch in order to make kind of a curly edge on jersey. So I'm gonna grab this piece of jersey and place it in a little bit at an angle. I will make sure that the outer edge on the right side is aligned with the very right edge of the inside window. And I changed the settings of my zigzag, so now the width is 5 and the length is only 1, because I want this to be very dense. So I will grab the end of the fabric and the front, and I will kind of start pulling it so that this would be pulled into the length. And I will start sewing with zigzag. I will make sure that the zigzag hits the very edge, and I will always pull the fabric so that it will stretch out. And you can see that I'm still moving it a little bit at an angle. That's especially important when you're using this for jersey, because again, the sewing machine would kind of slide it to the side a little bit. And you can see as I'm sewing and stretching the fabric out, it creates this nice curl. Of course, it doesn't look so great because I'm using contrast yarn. So if you would use a yarn that matches the fabric, it would look, of course, prettier. But this is a really great trick. And it's especially pretty on sleeves or on skirts or dresses. And here we have it. I swapped my needle for a needle for stretchy fabrics, and I also changed the settings of my sewing machine. So I'm using the stitch from this button, that's the stretchy overlock stitch. It sews the fabric together with kind of an edging at the same time. And I have here these pockets, which is where I can save certain stitches that I'm using on a regular basis, so that I don't have to adjust the width and the length all the time. And these are the settings that I like using. So I have basically the maximum width, and the length is 3. That's the one that I like using for stretchy fabric. That's what works with my sewing machine, but that's something you have to figure out. And that's why it's really important to grab a little pieces of fabric and trying out these things first, because I remember the previous machine that I had, a little bit different settings for this type of stitch worked on the previous machine than on this one. Alright, and now let's go and try out the overlock stitch. So I'm simply gonna fold this jersey, and I'm gonna grab a few pins, and I'm gonna pin this edge at an angle. This is something I like doing because that way I can keep the pins inside of the fabric while sewing. I mean, theoretically, the needle could still catch on them and break, but it's relatively unlikely, and it happens, at least from my experience, very rarely. And that way you don't have to go through with the running stitch first, and it saves time. So I'm gonna move the fabric so that the right edge is aligned with the right edge of the inside window. And I'm gonna move pretty close to the end here because I want to start sewing here. But that's something you have to be really careful about, because sometimes, especially with stretchy fabrics, the machine likes to kind of feed the fabric inside, and especially when your needle is not sharp enough, the machine might start eating the fabric. So therefore, always grab a spare piece of the fabric you're working with and try these things first. So we have the overlock stitch set up, maximum width, which is 7 on this machine, and the length is 3. And I'll do the sew up first, and let's start. And I will apply very little pressure on the pedal because I want to control the way the machine is moving the fabric. I mean, if I would step on it full speed, this is what it would look like. But I personally like sewing a little bit slower, especially when I have pins in. And now let's do the sew up and chop the fabric. So I will remove the pins, and then you can see what the stitch looks like. So you can see the way I aligned the edge with the inside window. There's still a little distance towards the edge of the fabric, which is what I usually then chop away. But I'm always making sure that I don't cut through the stitches. But I just like sewing a little bit further from the edge, because I find that the stretchy fabric doesn't stretch out so much when I'm not sewing exactly on the edge. But you can still see that it is kind of stretched out, which is why I normally go even a little bit further from the edge. And that's what we're gonna do now. I'm not gonna put in the pins this time, and I'm gonna align the edge of the sewing foot with the edge of the fabric, and then we can compare the result. Now, I don't know if you can notice, but I find that the way I have sewn through now, a bit further from the edge, the fabric looks a little bit neater and it's not so stretched out. So here you can see in reality why I actually prefer sewing a little bit further from the edge. So whenever I'm making something of jersey fabrics, I'm always adding proper seam allowance so that I can sew a bit further from the edge, because look at that, this is so much neater than the original seam, right? So much about the stretchy overlock stitch. So I definitely recommend trying out first on a spare piece of jersey what works the best for you, if it makes sense with your sewing machine to go a little bit further from the edge or not. And now we're gonna work with another stretchy stitch that I love. It's a stitch that I love using for edging, and it's the stretchy zigzag. So I don't know if you can see it well because this is pretty bright, but it looks like a zigzag but made of multiple stitches. So the V's are not just single stitches, but it's always like 3 or 4 stitches. And the standard settings on my sewing machine, wait, hold on. The standard settings are width is 5 and the length is 1, but I have it saved with the width 7 and the length of the stitch 2.5, because from my experience with the type of stretchy fabrics I'm working with, that's what works the best for me. Again, that's something you will have to figure out on your sewing machine because it might differ from machine to machine. And to give you an idea how it works, I'm gonna fold this edge over. So you could of course also pin it at an angle, but this is gonna be fine. And I will move so far that the left edge of the window will be aligned with the edge of the folded fabric. And now I will sew through with the stretchy zigzag. And here's what it looks like. The great thing is, because it's stretchy, the edge will stretch out properly and you don't have to worry about the stitches to rip. Whereas if you would use just stretchy straight stitch, it would have, I would say, like a little bit bigger limitation than this one, because this you can totally stretch out a lot. So if you, for example, edging a bottom edge of a stretchy dress or a skirt or a shirt, that's something I definitely recommend using. And of course, this is very visible because it's a contrast color for the purpose of this video, but whenever you use matching yarn, it of course looks much nicer. So definitely a great edging stitch, and you can again try out a few settings. So let's make it a little bit narrower. So I went 2 points narrower. I'm just gonna sew through without anything else, without any folding. Okay, the fabric got almost caught, and you can see when I decreased the width of the stitch and kept the same length, it looks a little bit flatter. Now let's do the opposite. I'm gonna make it wider again, but I'm gonna make the stitch shorter so that you have an idea what it looks like. And here you have it. I personally find that it doesn't look much different from this one. If you ask me whether the length of the stitch was different here, I could not really tell much difference, but the width definitely made a difference when you look at this seam on the right side. So again, you just have to try out a little bit of what works with the type of fabric you're gonna work with and with the settings on your sewing machine, and see what's gonna look the best and what's gonna work the best for you and for your project. I now swapped the needle to a denim needle, and I'm gonna grab this denim fabric and I'm gonna show you what it would look like if I would edge the edge with simply a zigzag stitch. This is basically the next step once you worked with some basic fabrics and practiced sewing straight and tried out a few settings. You can try that on different fabrics. So this fabric is much thicker than the cotton fabric with the checked pattern that we used first, and it's gonna probably also feel differently. And also, while I'm gonna do that, wanted to mention a few things. Now, the sewing machine has here these teeth that move the fabric away from you. You should never pull on the fabric into the opposite direction with force. However, it helps when you kind of help guiding the fabric through, especially when you're sewing around the edge, because what you want is the fabric to move through so that the stitch will be straight. And as I mentioned a couple of times, sometimes it really helps to hold the fabric at an angle and kind of help moving the sheet of fabric gently inside, if that makes any sense. So I'll start sewing. I'll skip the sew up this time. So this is a pretty dense zigzag, and I'm not pulling at the fabric, I'm rather kind of pushing it gently inside, a little bit at an angle, so that the needle moves towards the edge only and not further than that. And this is again something that needs practice. You just have to pay attention what the needle is doing and how the fabric changes the position. That might at the beginning sound like a lot, but trust me, this will become so natural after a few pieces that you made that you won't even have to think about it anymore. So, and here is what the zigzag looks like. So this is stretchy denim, and because I made the zigzag very dense, it stretched the denim out a little bit. That's what I wanted to show you. So this is something you have to keep in mind. So sometimes you would have to iron on interfacing if you would want to do that, or simply make the zigzag stitch a little bit longer. So I'm gonna change the settings. I'm gonna go to 1.8 instead of 1. And here's the result. So when you compare it to the first zigzag stitch that I made, it's definitely nicer, flatter, because this is almost curly here on the bottom, and that's why we are practicing. So especially if you are at the beginning, if you just started out and if you don't have the experience with different types of fabric, it's always a great idea to grab a few spare pieces of fabric and try out a few things, a few settings, so that you know what to expect from your sewing machine. And that's gonna be it for this video. Now you should have a really great idea about how to get started, what to do when you just got your first sewing machine, or what to do when you got a new sewing machine. I really recommend trying out a few things on spare pieces of fabric first, ideally on different materials with different types of needles, because then you will be able to judge your sewing machine much better. You will know what to expect, and that's gonna give you overall way more confidence when you're gonna move on to actual sewing projects. And that is going to be it for today. I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video and that it was helpful for you. Thank you all for watching and happy sewing.